In the 1970s, the shadowy depths of Highgate Cemetery, London, became the centre of what would go on to become an enduring urban legend. As two men, both with their own views on what the cemetery was hiding, dug deep into their investigations of the grounds, reports spread of a dark, otherworldly figure stalking its overgrown graves. Sometimes tall, sometimes with glowing red eyes, and other times with a dark top hat, the press reports of the unknown figure stoked a public fear of a secret occult world that lay just out of sight, crawling beneath the surface of an otherwise decent society. This is Dark Histories, where the facts are worse than fiction. Hello and welcome to Dark Histories Season 8, Episode 21. I'm your host Ben. As always, it's good to be back. I have had the dreaded COVID over the last few weeks, the last week. So my voice is a little bit broken up, but I think it's going to be okay. Hopefully it's bearable for you and not too much of a problem. But yeah, we crack on, eh? To be honest, I'm just quite glad to get out of the way because last year I had it, I came down with COVID on Christmas Eve. So it completely destroyed like Christmas and New Year. It was just a complete dead rubber. So yeah, to be honest, this year I'm just kind of glad to have got it out of the way so know that Christmas will be fine. So yeah. Anyway, shall we move on? Because we don't like talking about COVID. Yes, this week episode, I did actually manage to finish the majority of the script before I was ill. So hopefully it's legible and makes sense. If it goes a bit wrong, that we'll blame that on like fever dreams or something. But we should be all right. This week's episode is called Farrant, Manchester and the Highgate Vampire. Largely considered to have started in the 1980s in America, the Satanic Panic was an international moral panic that saw thousands of cases of satanic ritual abuse, along with alleged crimes and secret groups and cults that centered around the presence of demons or demonology. In almost all of the cases, the accusations were unsubstantiated and many were little more than hearsay and urban legends that had spread like wildfire, or the outcome of hoaxes and pranks played on tense and primed communities on the lookout for the devil around every corner, thanks in no small part to a sensationalist press that were happy to stoke the flames in order to fuel their sails. The origins of the Satanic Panic eventually culminated in the McMartin preschool trial of 1983 that saw one of the longest and most expensive legal trials in American history involving the McMartin family, who operated a Californian daycare center, originally arrested facing hundreds of accusations of satanic ritual abuse carried out on the children attending their school, including the alleged crimes of sexual abuse, witchcraft and orgies. The case ran for 7 years, spanning much of the decade and ending with 0 convictions and all charges being dropped. However, it had been heavily reported on, keeping much of the trial's more bizarre accusations firmly in the public conscience. Following the boom in interest in the case, a surge of accusations against other daycare centres across the country made talk shows and news outlets as preachers, TV shows and books took fear of the occult to a mainstream audience. Before long, people were finding satanic messages in everything from music to Dungeons and Dragons. Although the rise of Christian conservatism in America during the 1970s is often pointed to as the genesis that paved the way for the Satanic Panic that took off in the years following, it was far more than the moral outcry against popular culture that they spearheaded against the release of films like Rosemary's Baby in 1968 and The Exorcist in 1973 that primed society for the hysteria. And the truth is, the Satanic Panic has roots stretching back much, much further and far away from American shores. Originally precursored by nearly 400 years of witch hunts, the fear of evil demonic forces infiltrating regular everyday communities via secret covens, groups or strange outsiders has had a long storied history throughout the world. On British shores, the fear never truly left, not even after the Enlightenment, and it made its way into modern culture via the continued suspicion of esoteric groups like the Masons in the 19th century. Rumours of the Masons taking part in ritual murder were prevalent as early as the 1830s and peaked in the 1850s when several lodges found themselves accused of carrying out sacrificial rites using newborn babies. In the 1890s, a journalist named Leo Taxel stirred up a demonic panic when he accused lodges of practicing Satanism in order to instigate an international conspiracy via orgies, human and animal sacrifice, and devil summoning. His published writings turned out to be a hoax, but named prominent figures from London, such as William Wynne Westcott, one of the founders of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a secret society dedicated to studying occult magic that would soon scoop up figures like Aleister Crowley into their membership. Before long, such societies were being branded as satanic and accused of carrying out black masses, both in reality and even more prominently in fiction, blurring the lines of what exactly was truth and what was simply capitalising on a wave of hysteria that saw secret groups, often made up of well-to-do wealthy members, infiltrating all levels of British society in order to undermine the status quo for their own ends. By the 1950s, writers like Robert Fabian, the ex-superintendent at Scotland Yard, were muddying the waters of truth further when he published his book detailing crimes that he was convinced were linked to Satanism, whilst making claims that Satanists gathered all over London in secret temples, daubing pentagrams all over the walls, lighting black candles and chanting magical rituals in their worship of the devil. The birth of Wicca didn't help matters either, when Gerald Gardner published Witchcraft Today in 1954, promoting the Book of Shadows and secret witchcraft covens whose traditions stemmed all the way back to medieval times. Despite its relatively benign philosophies, the public were perfectly quick to distort reality and turn the group onto devil worshippers who had turned from God in order to chase pleasure and power. Numerous police inquiries were opened into alleged sacrificial rites throughout the decade, including one reported by occult author Leslie Roberts in a small village called Rottingdean, just outside Brighton, in December of 1958. Openly gay during a time when such admissions were still illegal, Roberts was no stranger to controversy. So when he alleged that a baby had been sacrificed during an occult ritual whilst giving a lecture for the Forum Society in Brighton, he was quite happy to fan the flames of satanic panic for the papers. According to Roberts, the baby had been sacrificed on a black magic altar in the quiet English village, and moreover, in Eastbourne, a sleepy seaside town 20 miles along the coast from Brighton, humans were being frequently sacrificed, he said. Little did Roberts realise there were journalists amongst his audience, and he was soon being escorted to the local police station by a national hack who couldn't believe his luck, hoping to blow the story into front-page news. Roberts gave police what he called 2 important clues to the alleged address of the black ritual, and told the press that he had requested protection due to threats having been made upon his life. Within 24 hours, the press were dismissing the whole story, however, after the police had decided that the entire affair was nothing else but nonsense. Roberts continued to tout the whole thing as true for several years after, and though it was almost definitely little more than a hoax or an unsubstantiated claim, probably to help him sell a few books, it's a good example of how a few offhand comments about witchcraft, occult magic or Satanism could so quickly blow up into national stories at the time. In that same year, a string of church robberies in Lancashire had already been hung firmly at the door of Satanists carrying out secret black masses. Another related story to hit the national press came in March of 1963, when a series of graves had been opened in a churchyard in Bedfordshire, and the papers reported on the scattered feathers of a sacrificial cock. The police had allegedly discovered this on the scene, alongside the bones of desecrated graves, which had been placed in what they said was a pattern used for the Black Mass. In the papers, the churchwarden himself accused a local gang who had carried out black magic rites and some kind of devil worship. Before long, the grave robberies were being blamed on everything from simple plundering to fantastical psychic attacks. According to the Reverend Barker, who was attributed to the church in question throughout the 60s, there had not been a single month during his tenure where black magic devil worship had not been a fixture for his poor rural churchyard. By now, Anton LaVey had founded his Church of Satanism in America, and Wiccan beliefs had matured into a diverse and well-followed counterculture that was being exported around the globe. Popular culture had grabbed hold of a flourishing occult horror novel market and transposed it to film, with the likes of Ham Horror releasing a wealth of low-budget horror movies, capitalising on the public fear of these secret satanic rituals, as Christopher Lee forged a career out of playing blood-drinking satanic vampires for the big screen. By the 1970s, this long stream of panic and fear within British culture had led to a society that were well versed in the secret rituals of the Satanists, with an official police force and clergy that were more than happy to associate criminal activity with black magic. This stream of press reports, stoking the public's fear, culminated in what would be one of the most infamous bouts of hysteria, when reports came flooding in of a vampire who had been stalking through the Victorian mausoleums of Highgate Cemetery in London during the early months of 1970, close to 10 years before the official beginning of the so-called Satanic Panic. One of the most famous and historically significant cemeteries in the whole of Britain, Highgate Cemetery was designed by the 19th century architect Stephen Geary and opened on 20th of May 1839 as one of 7 new cemeteries built in London in order to tackle the health hazard of a severe overcrowding problem that had swamped the capital's existing cemeteries in the earlier part of the 19th century. Situated in Camden, in North London, its 37 acres of sprawling woodland were once the grounds of a grand estate belonging to Ashurst House, a 17th century manor once owned by the Bank of England founder and London Mayor William Ashurst. In later centuries, with the house sold, abandoned and eventually demolished, the gardens were sold off to the London Cemetery Company in 1836, who set about implementing their plans for Highgate Cemetery. Designed to resemble a garden, complete with winding paths, terraces and ornamental landscaping, once opened, the labyrinthine corridors were quickly to be filled with elaborate tombs, vaults and headstones and, thanks to the Victorian trends towards the Gothic, included several statement sections, including the Egyptian Avenue with its imposing obelisks, and the Circle of Lebanon, where a ring of stone catacombs circle an ancient cedar tree. Thanks to this striking architecture, Highgate was quickly elevated to one of the most fashionable places to be buried throughout the 19th century, and the wealthy and elite were quick to secure their own resting place in the grounds in order to seal their status in society long after they were dead. As a consequence, an extension was opened in 1855, and by the end of the century, it was home to over 100,000 of the city's souls, including George Eliot, Karl Marx and Michael Faraday, amongst the many other esteemed individuals. By the mid-20th century, however, the cemetery had fallen into disrepair, as the ownership failed to maintain upkeep once cremation became more popular and the grounds became financially impractical. With its original ownership falling into bankruptcy, the cemetery was absorbed into another company and then quickly fell to ruin. This new, wild, overgrown presence of the grounds, which saw nature reclaim much of the environment, only worked to enhance the dark, brooding visual aspect of the cemetery that worked in tandem with the Gothic feel of the place. With its importance cemented in popular culture, its Gothic architecture and its obvious links to the dead, Highgate was always a place for a perpetual rumour mill for hauntings. But by the 1960s, it took on a whole new life as an occult paradise. As one Wiccan practitioner put it in her book on pagan witchcraft in 2013, the atmosphere at Highgate Cemetery in the early 1970s was deliciously dark, not in an evil or sinister sense, but as a place where the other world was only a step away. And so it comes as no surprise that ghost stories have always flowed freely from the cemetery, spanning from casual anecdotes to firmly rooted urban legends. Most of the stories are relatively vague and scant on details, and all tend to follow a similar arc. One such story was reported by a London-based chartered accountant using the pseudonym of Thornton in the late 1960s. In his story, Thornton said he had been eating his lunch in Highgate before walking it off with a quick potter around the cemetery. A hobbyist amateur photographer, Thornton had taken his camera along with him and spent the better part of the early afternoon making his way through the tombs, snapping photos as he went, until he heard the distant ringing of a bell, signalling to visitors that the cemetery would soon be closing its gates for the evening. Being a superstitious person, or even believing in ghosts, Thornton walked calmly around, looking for the gate when he suddenly became aware of the presence of something behind him. Swinging around, less than 6 feet away, he saw a tall, dark spectre hovering just above the ground. He found himself transfixed to the spot, completely unable to move, drained of energy by some powerful hypnotic force that in a matter of seconds rendered him unconscious to any sense of time or being able to recognize his surroundings. So great was the intensity of this force that he remained like this for several minutes, or what seemed like several minutes, before the spectre abruptly vanished and he slowly regained his normal faculties. In 1965, an ex-army officer, Brian Bourne, was walking along the lane dividing the west of the cemetery from the east on his way to a party one evening, when suddenly he noticed what he described as a curious silence as all the birds quietened and an eerie, oppressive atmosphere fell over the road. I was 10 yards from the north gate when I happened to look across at it. What I saw was that what appeared to be a black treacle flowing down and running over the wall. It touched the ground and actually flowed like a big black pool of liquid into the centre of the path, about 6 feet before me. There was an icy coldness which grew more intense with the passing seconds, literally an Arctic cold. The hairs on my neck, for the first time in my life, actually stood on end. With dusk falling full on the perimeter wall, the path was in shadow, but there was a shadow, discernible within that shadow. I thought, what am I watching? What the hell is this? The most horrible part was, and I still have nightmares about it, I still wake up in a cold sweat, it reared up. I'd estimate its height at between 7 or 8 feet. I'm 5 feet 8 inches tall, and it towered over me. It was enormous. It was neither solid nor transparent. My overall impression was that it was a black figure wearing dark garments which flowed and stirred in the wind, but there was no wind. The edges of what it was wearing were moving. There was no face. Where eyes would have been, if it were a human, there were just 2 red pits, red glows, and I was very conscious that it was looking at me. At that point, I realized that I was up against an entity that was both powerful and malignant. It was radiating evil. That was the only way I could describe it. This wasn't a ghost. This was an entity. There was nothing remotely human about it. It simply was not human. As an ex-army officer, I'd come up against life-threatening situations, but faced with that thing, the fear was worse than anything you could imagine. In 1989, a young photography student studying at North London's Camberwell Art College told a story of how he and his classmates paid a visit to the cemetery only to capture some truly bizarre images. Once we entered the cemetery, it was still misty in there. We started on our tour and, one by one, all of our cameras stopped working. Jammed shutters, newly charged batteries going flat. It was all very odd. One girl, called Katrina, managed to get a few snaps off in an area which looked like an Egyptian tomb before her camera stopped working. We developed all our own photos as part of the photography section of our degree course. Kat's photos had an old woman's face on the prints in different sizes and positions. We all found that to be very chilling. The woman had a blank look on her face. We told Kat to sell the photos, but she thought they were some sort of forewarning, as she was very religious. I don't know what happened to them, but I don't think I'd want to see them again. I had about 3 photos from the visit showing the strange mist, etc., before our camera stopped working. It's not entirely unusual, then, to hear stories of figures interrupting the many tours of the Western Cemetery, affecting whole groups. Sometimes the figure of a black-cloaked man is seen. At other times, the man is said to be wearing a top hat, and at other times a black cowl, whilst many have attributed flaming red eyes to what is, allegedly, the same spectre. But things are not always as they seem, and many ghost stories from Highgate have been little more than misunderstandings or even straight hoaxes. In 1895, a shopkeeper complained after 10 of his windows were inexplicably smashed one night. The story kicked up a local scandal for a few hours as rumours made their way through the streets that whatever it was that had smashed the panes of glass had no earthly body and had likely come from the cemetery. The following night, the same shop windows found themselves under attack once more, except on this occasion, a young 15-year-old girl named Alice Clark, who had been employed in the service of the shopkeeper, was caught red-handed as she hurled a stone through one of the remaining windows, which put a sharp end to the short-lived ghostly panic. The escapades of a young, disgruntled servant girl, however, is a pretty far cry from the most infamous controversy to take place around Highgate Cemetery. The case of the Highgate vampire almost certainly takes that accolade, thanks to its explosion across the country in 1970, when stories of the unholy poured into the press, creating a panic that would be reflected for years to come, as the satanic panic gripped an international audience. By the 1960s, Highgate Cemetery was in its most dire state of disrepair. A decade or more before any organised effort would be formed to maintain the overgrowth, bushes and shrubs had made traversing much of the grounds almost impossible without serious tools, and a lot of the architecture, like the gates and surrounding walls, had deteriorated so far that the cemetery had become something of a free-for-all for the homeless and local gangs. Vandalism was rife, with many of the headstones and vaults being smashed open, and as more reports of vandalism crept out, the stories gradually began to morph into something else. Instead of gangs and the common rebellion of youth, reports of strange occult groups were being blamed, especially as the remains from some of these smashed tombs were being strewn around across the paths. Even more sensational were the reports of a tall, dark spectre who had allegedly been seen on several occasions, and on one of these occasions had used some kind of supernatural power to bind one of the witnesses to the floor, rooting them to the spot. For several years, the cemetery had been the interest of another group, however. Neither homeless nor vandals, the British Occult Society had been spending time in the cemetery since its founding in 1964 in order to investigate some of these local ghost stories. Founded by a small group of friends, including David Farrant, a psychical investigator and practicing Wiccan, and Sean Manchester, a would-be exorcist, the British Occult Society had been receiving reports of ghostly figures for some time before they decided that their best course for action was to head into the cemetery themselves. At first it was all fun and games. We would wander about, frighten ourselves to death and come out again, Farrant told a local newspaper. But at some point, the investigations took something of a turn, and Farrant decided to take it upon himself to spend the night in the cemetery on the evening of the winter solstice, Sunday the 21st of December 1969. Being the middle of the winter, the night was cold, with temperatures dropping close to freezing, and the ground, still damp from the grey and drizzly day, gave the air an uncomfortable chill. Arriving at the gates to the cemetery just before midnight, he didn't have to wait long to find what he was looking for. There in the cemetery was what looked to be a tall person, until David realised that his height was actually over 7 feet tall. Describing the being's eyes, he said they were not human, rather reflecting some alive presence. Struggling to pull his eyes from whatever it was, he eventually turned away just after the presence vanished. After seeing this figure 3 more times, once on Christmas Eve, again a week later, and then again in February, Farrant decided the best thing to do was to try and gather more data from the locals. And so, to that end, he wrote a letter to the Hampstead and Highgate Express, published on the 6th of February 1970, appealing for anyone else who might have seen anything unnatural in the cemetery to come forward with their stories. "I have no knowledge in this field," David wrote, "and I would be interested to hear if any other readers have seen anything of this nature." Luckily for David, the locals were more than amenable to this strange request, and over the following week, the paper printed several letters from other readers. One said that there had been rumours of a spirit that showed up nightly, every day, for 1 week of every month, for years. Whilst another mentioned a tall man in a hat who walks across the lane dividing the east and west cemeteries, whilst the mysterious tolling of the cemetery chapel bell rang in the distance. Once this figure reaches the other side of the lane, he apparently disappears through the wall. Within a week, Highgate was on the front page, as more and more witness accounts rolled in to the editor. One told of seeing a vision of a spectral figure who waded into a pond before turning and gesturing for the witness to follow. 2 further witnesses said they saw a woman in white pass straight through the locked gates. Meanwhile, David Farrant, who had by now split from Manchester to form his own arm of the British Occult Society, had been on the front page of the Hampstead and Highgate Express again. This time, it was to air his theory that the being in the cemetery was, perhaps, far more dangerous than a mere ghost. The mysterious death of foxes in Highgate Cemetery was this week linked with the theory that a ghost seen in the area might be a vampire. Tobacconist Mr. David Farrant, 24, who first reported seeing the ghost last month, returned to the spot last weekend and discovered a dead fox. Several other foxes have also been found in the cemetery, he said at his home in Priestwood Mansions, Archway Road, Highgate. The odd thing is there was no onward sign of how they died. More remains unexplained, but what I have recently learned all points to the vampire theory as being the most likely answer. Should this be so, I for one am prepared to pursue it, taking whatever means might be necessary so that we can all rest. Despite their split, Sean Manchester was, nevertheless, apparently thinking along the same lines as Farrant. He explained his own theory in the same article where he told the reporter that autopsies had been carried out on the foxes and fang marks had been found on their desiccated corpses. He believed the vampire was the king vampire of the dead, and going further, he speculated that the vampire's body had been brought to England from Wallachia, medieval Romania, and placed into an estate house that stood on the grounds now belonging to the Highgate Cemetery. He then linked the vandalism of the cemetery to satanic rituals being carried out by an occult group aware of this vampire history, and rather alarmingly, explained how he was willing to deal with the situation. Now that there is so much desecration of graves by Satanism, I am convinced that this has been happening in Highgate Cemetery in an attempt by a body of Satanists to resurrect the king vampire. We would like to exorcise the vampire by the traditional and approved manner. Drive a stake through his heart with one blow just after dawn between Friday and Saturday, chop off his head with a gravedigger's shovel, and burn what remains. This is what the clergy did centuries ago, but we'd be breaking the law today. Although the general gist of both the men's theories was the same, that a vampire was on the loose, thanks to satanic rituals taking place in the cemetery, it was quite clear that Manchester had gone a little more overboard and into the realms of camp vampire fiction, a line that Farrant wasn't quite willing to cross, and this rift had begun to show between Manchester and Farrant, who were both claiming in the press to have been the president of the British Occult Society. Things really blew up a week later when ITV, who had quickly realised the local media attention this real-life Hammer horror story was getting, filmed and aired a documentary on its Today programme, interviewing both Farrant and Manchester. In this documentary, Farrant claimed to have been in receipt of threatening letters, whilst Manchester cautioned him publicly on his investigations, telling the interviewer that he didn't believe David had the knowledge to carry out a proper investigation without getting himself hurt. Drama between Farrant and Manchester aside, the TV crew also interviewed several of the locals who claimed to have seen this creature, one of which said he had seen its face and thought it looked like it had been dead for a long time. Not everyone was, of course, so quick to buy the vampire story. One local church minister, Christopher Neil Smith, said the vampire was a novel embellishment, whilst William Law, the general foreman of the gravediggers, who had worked at Highgate for decades, told the documentary, "Well, I think they're nutcases, actually. That's my opinion of them." Broadcast at 6 p.m. on Friday the 13th of March, the results of the documentary were entirely predictable. Within 2 hours, the cemetery was swarmed by a crowd of would-be vampire hunters and legend trippers who were clambering to catch a glimpse of this vampire king. As people scrambled over the walls to get into the cemetery, 40 police officers were called in to try and control the rowdy sightseers, eventually being forced to root out those that had got inside the grounds with searchlights. It was like the end of a Frankenstein film when the monster was chased, Manchester said of the crowd. People had weapons and looked as if they could turn nasty if they had seen a tall, lean person in dark clothing. One of this crowd was Alan Blood, a history teacher labelled as a vampire expert by the press, who had travelled 40 miles from Essex with several of his pupils in order to see what he said was an undead Satan-like being. He wasn't the only one to link Satanists and occult worship either. Once again, Manchester was quick to point fingers and stoke fires, telling the papers that the desecrations throughout the cemetery were too much to be merely the work of vandals. There are black magic signs and symbols, limbs and even entire bodies missing from the graves. It all points to something very evil. The next night, several more people came, though the crowds were considerably smaller and easier to round up. 5 young lads who had been caught creeping about in the grounds were thrown out after they told the police that they'd been looking to catch a glimpse of an occult ceremony, but wound up just getting lost. As each night drew on, however, the story slowly began to quiet down, and visitors to the cemetery became less and less. Meanwhile, neither Sean Manchester nor David Farrant had given up on whatever it was that they believed was stalking through the graves. Sean Manchester had been spending quite a lot of time investigating a case reported to him by a young man named Keith McLean, who was convinced that his girlfriend, Elizabeth Voideler, was being attacked by the entity after she had witnessed it whilst walking down the lane dividing the east and west of the cemetery one night with a friend. Since that night, Elizabeth told Manchester that she had been suffering nightmares where she had seen images of graves opening up and of someone staring at her from behind her bedroom window, its pale face trying to force its way into her room. The face she described as, "It has the face of a wild animal with glaring eyes and sharp teeth, but it is a man with the expression of an animal. The face is gaunt and grey." Furthermore, she seemed to be growing more and more anemic by the day, and her boyfriend, Keith, had discovered what he said were 2 inflamed mounds on her neck. She was also aware of some kind of psychic pull towards Highgate Cemetery. Convinced that Elizabeth's aggressor was nothing but the Vampire King himself, Manchester supplied her with a crucifix, sprinkled her bedroom with holy water, and carried out a kind of exorcism, after which her condition seemed to improve. Despite this fairly extreme case, things had fallen fairly quiet around Highgate. At least until the morning of the 1st of August, when a small group of girls visiting the cemetery stumbled upon the burnt remains of a headless corpse that had been dragged from a nearby broken vault. Once again, happy to pounce on this story, the Hampstead and Highgate Express wrote up a piece about the disturbing discovery, linking it firmly with the work of Satanists, and interviewing Manchester, who explained that the corpse, having had its head missing, was an important detail that proved that Satanists were hoping to resurrect the Vampire King. With perfect drama, he explained, "These same Satanists that desecrate Highgate Cemetery are disciples of the evil one, the vampire, and intend to spread the cult in the hope of corrupting the world." The result of this find turned out to be the police ensuring the public that they would bolster their patrols around the cemetery with extra men, which turned out to have some fairly large consequences for David Farrant, who had been carrying on with his own investigations into the cemetery's dark entity. Farrant was arrested on the night of the 17th of August when he was found stalking out a gravesite in the north end of the cemetery carrying a wooden crucifix and stake. He told the police that he'd been watching for the vampire and was planning to drive a stake through its heart and then run away. His presence in the cemetery that night, however, was a little more involved than that. He'd been there with several other members of the British Occult Society, and together they said they'd been carrying out a séance with which they hoped to establish a connection to the vampire in order to communicate with it. Fortunately for Farrant, he was exonerated a month later when his case was thrown out of the Clerkenwell court after his lawyer argued that hunting a supernatural being was not in itself a crime, and since the cemetery was not legally defined as an enclosed area, the charge of being in an enclosed area for an unlawful purpose had no bearing. Within a day, Farrant was back in the press and back on the trail of the vampire, telling the Daily Mirror, "I won't rest until I catch this vampire." Though his actions, and those of the British Occult Society, took on more of a vigilante element, promising to help the police catch whatever dark occult group was using the graves and corpses of the cemetery to enact their rituals. Manchester, too, had been doing something similar, though always slightly more extreme. He had been carrying out exorcisms, complete with incense and holy water. In a new case, similar to the one that he had investigated concerning Elizabeth Voideler, Manchester had been made aware of a girl from the Highgate area named Louisa, who, like Elizabeth, had been feeling an inexplicable draw to Highgate Cemetery. As Manchester writes it, he had followed Louisa to the cemetery one night when she had been sleepwalking and supposedly uncovered what he believed had been the vampire's lair, where he set about throwing around salt, holy water and garlic. By October, the actions of both men was deemed interesting enough by the BBC to send a documentary crew to Highgate to collect footage for a programme 24 hours, within which they interviewed both men.
Highgate Cemetery, officially opened in 1839, was once described as the most beautiful resting place in London. In the last few years, vandals stalking around the overgrown tombs have done over £9,000 worth of damage. For the general foreman of the gravediggers, William Law, who's worked here 23 years, it's worsened an already harrowing job.
Down this part here, there's 2 tombs broken into. One on the left-hand side here, the doors were broken open. The coffin was half pulled over and a big iron stake was stuck through into the coffin.
These indications of a black ritualism at work aroused the curiosity of Sean Manchester, 26-year-old president of the British Occult Society, an organisation that practices the art of white magic, the combat of evil.
Our first report indicated that there may be a vampire in Highgate Cemetery. A spectre was seen at that gate there, appearing to come from here, which leads to the catacombs.
The former associate of Mr. Manchester, Alan Farrant, who used to own this tobacconist shop in Highgate, decided to pay a midnight visit to the cemetery to combat the vampire once and for all. He armed himself with a cross and stake and crouched between the tombstones waiting.
Have you ever seen this vampire?
I have seen it, yes. I saw it last February and I saw it on 2 occasions.
What was it like?
It took the form of a tall, grey figure, about 8 feet tall, and it seemed to glide off the path without making any noise.
The only certain way of destroying an undead is by driving a wooden stake, like the one I have here, straight through the heart with one blow.
They also included a short clip of a reenactment of Manchester's exorcism.
Satan, get ye behind me and be gone from this place forever.
Meanwhile, the police patrols were still ongoing, and several arrests had been made, though in all cases no serious charges were ever brought to court. Then, one night, shortly after the documentary had aired on the BBC, Farrant was picked up by the police once again, this time on suspicion of possessing marijuana. Far from drugs, however, the suspicious herb turned out to be chamomile that David told police he'd been using as part of an exorcism ritual. When the full story hit the press, though, it perhaps would have been better if he had simply been smoking a bit of pot, given the attitudes of the public and their acceptance wholesale of the satanic angle to the whole story. Once released by the police, Farrant went ahead and explained to the press that he had found evidence that a group of occult black magicians had broken into a vault in the cemetery and had used it as a vessel for necromancy. Allegedly, pentagrams had been scrawled on the floor and candles burnt. In an effort to cleanse this area, Farrant and 8 other members of the British Occult Society had entered Highgate, he said, snuck into the vault, had the female members of the party undress, and then they read passages from both the Bible and ancient spellbooks while splashing about holy water and the incriminating chamomile. In one of Farrant's less clever moments, he had taken photos of the whole thing, which he said were to document the exorcism and to show to the police, though this would later come back to bite him fairly hard. Unsurprisingly, this story of naked rituals, pentagrams and exorcisms was like red rag to a bull for the press, who had a great time with the story, until, eventually, they did move on to something else, and the story of the Highgate vampire finally receded from the front pages, at least for a few years, when it would be reignited with a huge spark that would see Farrant in more legal trouble than he had ever been in before. Over the next few years, David Farrant continued to write stories about the Highgate vampire, publishing them in local papers across London. In them, he accused serious satanic black magicians of carrying out dark rituals, and dismissed the sceptical view that much of the graffiti and damage to Highgate had simply been disgruntled rebellious youth looking to kill some time and maybe give themselves a bit of a scare. Farrant's view was backed by the media, who continued to print stories about witchcraft and Satanism in Britain. The Daily Mirror, a widely read British tabloid, pushed headlines such as "Church Shut After Black Magic Raid," "Black Magic in Garden of Horror," and "Child Killed by a Satan." In one piece, they claimed there was more than 10,000 black magicians practicing within Britain. And then, the story took one of its more bizarre twists. Sometime early in 1973, flyers began circulating around London, advertising a magical duel between David Farrant and Sean Manchester. Apparently, the two old friends' differences had reached a catastrophic level, and they were now gearing up to end it in a way that most would consider to be somewhat off-kilter. Manchester had apparently been challenging Farrant for some time, even yelling his proposal for a duel late in 1972, as Farrant had walked out of court, having been arrested and fined for indecent behaviour when he'd been caught in a churchyard trying to summon the spirit of a pirate alongside a naked 20-year-old computer programmer. At this time, Farrant had declined the invitation, saying that he had no interest in a duel, but it seemed that by spring of 1973 he'd had a change of heart. In a scene of perfect drama, the duel was set to take place on Parliament Hill, high up on Hampstead Heath, overlooking the City of London, on the evening of April the 13th, 1973. Farrant eventually chose to swerve this magical punch-up, fearing for his safety from Manchester's crowd of supporters. Instead, Manchester performed an exorcism alone of what he called the evil powers of Farrant's magic, which, naturally, the press, who had sent representatives to watch the duel, loved every minute of. Unfortunately for Farrant, the duel was only the start of what would be a pretty intense and strange few years. In August that year, police uncovered a fairly macabre scene during their patrols of Highgate Cemetery, including a large occult symbol painted on the ground, a blood-stained knife next to a pool of blood, allegedly from a stray cat, and 3 burned candles. Attributing this scene to Farrant and his occult society, the Hornsey Journal wrote a detailed description of the ritual, which they said had been carried out to celebrate the Festival of the Black Moon. According to the journal, a naked high priestess had been smeared in the cat's blood, leading to what can only have been a fairly grim orgy taking place. Later, Farrant would explain that the whole thing had been a case of sensationalist rumours and misquotations. No dead cats were ever found, and no charges were ever brought against Farrant, but that did little to help the public's perception of him at the time. Not helping his own case, when an RSPCA inspector called for his prosecution, citing cruelty to animals, Farrant sent him a black box, within which he enclosed a voodoo doll with pins sticking into its head. Things all reached a boiling point for Farrant after the embalmed remains of a headless corpse were found propped up against a car outside Highgate Cemetery on the morning of the 12th of January 1974. The police's first port of call was, of course, to go and see David Farrant, who by now was a well-known nuisance to the cemetery, and when they raided his house, they found a vast collection of photos of the vandalism suffered by the cemetery, along with Farrant's photographs of the naked ritual that he'd carried out years earlier. Despite Farrant insisting that all these photos were doing were documenting the damage that he had found, and they weren't souvenirs of damage that he had personally carried out, he was promptly arrested and ordered to stand trial at the Old Bailey on the 10th of June later that year. Clearly tired of Farrant's presence in the cemetery, his charges ranged from body snatching to threatening a witness to a criminal trial. Choosing to defend himself, Farrant argued that he was being persecuted for his religious beliefs as a Wiccan, and denied having ever practiced necromancy, nor having carried out any such black magic ceremonies. Unfortunately, he was forced to concede that he had entered the ceremony on many occasions over the previous years, and whilst his arguments that all the vandalism and desecration had been carried out by what he called satanic cults, there were few that could see much of a distinction. In the end, Farrant was acquitted of the most damaging charges, but found guilty of breaking in and desecrating memorials at Highgate, along with using voodoo dolls to threaten people. Deemed perfectly sane in a medical evaluation, Farrant was sent to prison for 4 years and 8 months, a sentence which, to most onlookers, seemed harsh at best, with some papers accusing the judge of looking to make an example of Farrant in an increasingly hysteric atmosphere surrounding alleged Satanism. Though he appealed his sentence, his application was thrown out, and Farrant was sent to Wormwood Scrubs to serve his full sentence. In the years that followed David Farrant's arrest, the stories continued to flood into the press about Satanism, witchcraft and the occult. Farrant himself was accused of running a coven from inside his prison cell, with former prisoners selling their stories to the tabloids, detailing his bizarre rituals and claiming that he terrified his cellmate, an axe murderer, so much that the murderer had asked to be removed to solitary confinement just to get away from him. Farrant was eventually released from prison after serving 2 years of his sentence, and in later years managed to gain a certain degree of vindication after he successfully won a libel case against the News of the World, and the European Commission of Human Rights ruled in his favour, agreeing with Farrant that his rights had been infringed when he was forbidden to practice his Wiccan beliefs whilst in jail. Following his release, he re-established his society, renaming it the British Psychic and Occult Society, and continued to investigate the paranormal. Sean Manchester eventually became a bishop of the Old Catholic Church, where he continued to practice exorcism and carry on the rites that he believed the traditional churches had abandoned. He maintained his belief in vampires, saying that if he believed in angels, then it simply followed that he must believe in demons and therefore vampires too. The two men seemed to maintain their feud right up until Farrant's death in 2019. Following the Highgate vampire hysteria, the press continued to stoke the flames of what would eventually grow into a full-on satanic panic that would span across the waters. In America, reports of satanic cults began to multiply, eventually circling back round to Britain in the late 1980s. On a more positive note, after all the vandalism and desecration, the Highgate vampire and the panic that surrounded it did bring attention to the state of the old Victorian cemetery, leading to the formation of the Friends of Highgate Cemetery, who spent the next 15 years raising funds in order to restore the tombs and mausoleums to their original splendour. They continued to operate, running tours, keeping the wildlife from encroaching on more ground than is necessary, and maintaining the entire site. As for the Highgate vampire himself, the creature that was so heavily reported in the 60s and 70s eventually fell into urban legend, and stories still come out of the grounds today of supernatural activity, though no one has yet staked any vampirical hearts, at least none that made the news. So that was the, truly bizarre story of the Highgate vampire. There is a few bits that I'd like to talk about, so I'll do so after these short advert breaks. Welcome back. So, yes, that's the Highgate vampire, and there is a bit to talk about here, I guess. Firstly, I think what I find something fascinating about this case is that these days, the Highgate vampire, I think, is quite famous. It's quite a famous piece of urban urban legend, I guess. But interestingly, whereas a lot of urban legends tend to solidify and become... So if you look at the Mothman, for example, a lot of the early reports, and a lot of the reports in general of the Mothman are the same. So the sightings are the same, the descriptions are the same, things like that. And that seems to be the case of most urban legends, right? And because they are retellings of the same story over and over, and they might morph slightly, but generally the core is always the same. And that's what drives the legend, is it has to maintain some of the original, otherwise it doesn't become a legend, right? It's the repetition of that original core that creates the legend. But that's not the case with the Highgate vampire. The Highgate vampire name, in a sense, is the legend. The actual presence itself, I think if you said to someone, can you describe Mothman? If they're into urban legends, and if they're like me and you, they can probably describe Mothman, right? But if you said to someone, can you describe the Highgate vampire? I don't think they could. The name and the cemetery is the urban legend. The actual creature isn't. Oh, that's my opinion. I don't know. That's my own opinion. You do see it in the story, though, in the sense that all of the original sightings were so disparate. They were all different. They were like white ladies, grey ladies, men with top hats and black cloaks and things like this. 8-foot tall men with red eyes. They're all different. If anything, you would think the red eyes tends to get repeated, but that's it. And yet, interestingly, despite it being a cemetery, and saying, the obvious sort of argument here that a folklorist might make, or someone who's really into this and wants to sort of hold on to it, they could say, all the other things were just ghosts. It's a cemetery. Of course, it's haunted by a lot of things, but the real one was X, or the red eyes, or whatever. But they don't seem to do that. They seem to just assume that the stories seem to be that just all of these ghosts or sightings are the same thing, which I find really interesting. Anyway, that's just a sort of little side note that I recognised as I was sort of researching into it, that, yeah, it was quite disparate, and it's interesting how it's maintained an urban legend. And I think it's the strength of the cemetery that allows it to do that, because, like I say, it was almost like the cemetery is the urban legend. The vibe, that, like, the actual creature is not so important as long as it's got the name, the Highgate vampire, and it's attributed to the strength of that cemetery. I think that's what's important. But anyway, moving on. The story, there's clearly a lot of embellishment going on in the press. And at least even David Farrant himself has come out several occasions and been said that he was misquoted and misrepresented by the media. And I think in almost every situation. It seems he didn't really help himself, because he also admitted to saying a few things as jokes that were written up as if he said them seriously. But, you know, surely you should know better at this point, because he'd been, you know, if he had been misrepresented and misquoted so often, what's he doing sort of throwing out jokes? Excuse me. And it gets a little bit difficult to actually understand what he actually truly believed, because he then later on, at some points, has gone on to say that he never really did think that there was a vampire there in the first place. That's a strange thing to have said, because clearly he played this up, because he was filmed for a documentary holding a crucifix and a stake, just as one example. And clearly, if you watch the documentary piece, it is available. It's on YouTube. But it, you know, clearly he's hamming it up. He looks as if he's acting and hamming it up. But at the same time, you've got to suggest at that point the blame lies somewhat at his feet. You know, if he was goaded into it by the press, he could have said no. You know, he could have said, look, I don't believe it's a vampire. I'm not going to prowl around with this stake and crucifix pretending to be a vampire hunter. He could have said that, but he didn't. So in a sense, I think he's a bit of a victim of his own need for publicity. I think I don't blame him for that, you know, like a lot of young people or anyone really, you know, he probably just fell into the trap of thinking like, cool, I'm on the front page of the newspaper, you know, and I feel like it just sort of got blown up into massively out of proportion. You know, the press have a huge role to play in all of this. You know, clearly, you know, they absolutely love stoking the fires to sell papers. And I think they're equally as to blame as Farrant, who realistically was probably minding his own business. You know, I do believe him that he was taking photos to document the... well, he said he was taking photos to document the vandalism to show police. But if that's the case, why did he never show the police? What was he? At what point was the threshold that he had enough photos to then say, right, I'm going to take all of this to the police? I think he was probably just taking photos because he was a bit dark and he was taking photos of a cemetery and he just wanted to do that. I don't think he really did the majority of the vandalism. I think he I think if he really did have the beliefs that he said he had, I don't think that desecration would have been allowed or promoted. I think a lot of the problems in there in terms of the vandalism was just youth and stuff. And people said a lot of the marks that were spray painted and later said to be like Satanist symbols and stuff were just scribbles by youths or whatever. It kind of makes me feel old, youths. But yeah, so I don't think he was entirely to blame for the desecration and the vandalism. I don't think that was really him. That's worth talking about. The sheer amount of desecration that was going on at this time, and it gets pushed under the rug or not. I mean, it's brought to the forefront in a way, but the way the actual concept of the desecration is completely blown out of proportion and made into something else. So the desecration loses importance because the Satanism role becomes the important factor. Whereas actually, if we look at it, like that is unbelievable that people are going in there and pulling out like the remains of bodies. That's I mean, the sheer lack of respect for the dead is, and the lack of respect for the living, because these were people's families, these are the remains of people's ancestors, so that was quite unbelievable. The amount of graves that were being trampled over for a good story just felt quite horrible. I thought that was a bit of a shame, and again, it falls on the feet of the press, because the press didn't really care about the desecrations. They cared about them in as much as they were a vehicle to say, "Oh, look, Satanism," but they didn't really care. They didn't really seem to really give a monkeys that all this other fairly disgusting, abhorrent behaviour was happening, and no one was doing anything about it. No one was trying to help the cemetery, or rejuvenate the cemetery or look after it. I thought that was pretty unreal, really. Sean Manchester, I suppose, is the last part to talk about. Now, that man is just completely full of it. Whereas Farrant, I think he had beliefs, and I think he believed them. I think he genuinely had beliefs that he, was carrying out sort of rituals and things like that, and Wiccan beliefs and things like that. And I think generally his views weren't especially extreme. They were alternative for sure, but I don't think they were relatively necessarily extreme. Of course, you definitely say they're alternative beliefs, but I'd say it doesn't make them extreme. Manchester, on the other hand, is just completely full of it. He's one of those people where you wonder, is he just a chronic self-publicist, or does he genuinely believe what he says? Because some of the stuff that he came out with, I mean, I didn't include it in the story because it was just ridiculous. The sources that he uses in his book are questionable at best. He uses absolute gutter trash press as legitimate scientific sources. It tells you everything you need to know about the book, really. But I mean, some of his other claims in his book are just even more off the wall. And whilst they're quite funny and fun, you just end up thinking, like, if you believe this stuff, okay, fine, that's fine. You're a pretty wacky guy and probably quite interesting. But if you are just trying to make money out of this, and you just, like, I'm not going to mention names, but like these days in the UFO community, there's a lot of people like this that will just propagate claims because you've got to sell another book that's exactly the same as the last one. He just reminds me of that. Anyway, some of these claims, just to run them off my head, was that he's a descendant of Lord Byron. And at one point, he says that he was slaying a vampire, and it turned into a giant spider, which he quote unquote dispatched. And you just think, come on, man! Like you don't expect me to believe that. Like you don't expect me to believe that you followed someone to a mausoleum, attacked them with, I think, like holy water. They turned into a giant spider, and then you killed them. Okay, like, come on, man. This is the plot from Hammer Horror, like a Hammer Horror film. This is not real life. And so you wonder how much he believes. It's, was he writing it to be tongue in cheek? No, that's not the case, because if you see later interviews with him, he clearly takes himself very seriously. So, okay, does he believe it? Like, say, if he believes it, fine. If you want those beliefs, that's pretty wild. But whatever, man. Perhaps it was the 60s. Perhaps he was taking some pretty strong hallucinogens, or was he just a self-publicist? At which point you just think you're a bit gross. But yeah, anyway, that's that story. I think Farrant comes out of it, in my opinion, better than Manchester. I think neither of them really come out of it like super well, but I do think Farrant probably had the more, I don't know, like quote unquote authentic beliefs, at least authentic to himself. Anyway, So yeah, that's my opinions. If you have different opinions, you're welcome to let me know. Email me, contact@darkhistories.com. You can get in touch with me, say that's by the email or social medias, DM me, I'm usually on there. You can find all the links to that in the show notes as well as on the website, which is darkhistories.com. Otherwise, you can find links for everything else, ways that you can support. If you'd like to support, I've got a Patreon, and you get ad-free episodes, things like that. And it's obviously much appreciated, or there's merch, things like that. Anyway, all the links for that is in the show notes or on the website, darkhistories.com. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope my voice wasn't too much of a distraction or too grating for you. It'll be better next episode, or it better be. So until then, thanks very much for listening. Take care. Sleep tight.